I invite you to ask questions. We do not need a fourth lecture. No, we would like to have some punchy questions from the audience. Maybe a comment, but then it really should be a very quick comment. So I see Andrea Terzi, for example. There are guys coming around with microphones. I'll take maybe Andrea first. And then I can't see, it's a bit dark, and the colleague at the back on the very right next. Maybe we take a couple of questions.
I have a question for Vitor Constancio regarding the safe asset. What would you think if the ECB, in its function as the monopolist of the euro, as they define themselves, rightly so, on the website, begins issuing certificates of deposits that are one of the legal instruments available, and hence substitute with certificates of deposits at different maturities for the bank balances existing, and this way create a safe asset and also a yield curve for the euro area?
The colleague at the back, Oliver.
I have a question for Pettifor. So if I look at your analysis and then I try to put that what you said towards the Eurozone, would you agree with me that the most important thing in the Eurozone is to get rid of the prohibition of monetary financing and retake the financing of governments, like take it away from the financial sector and put it back in the hands of the people?
Thank you. Do we have?
What's your name?
Do
Oliver Pajsek.
we have on this side of the room questions? I didn't see any hands going up. No? So reluctant to speak. Philip wanted to ask a question, and then Danny Lang. We take Danny and Philip and then Danny, and then we'll have a round of answers.
Can I ask Professor Constancio, the European Central Bank had also another target, M3 money supply, 4.5%, which is very strange because in their model, the macroeconomic model of the ECB, there is no money. Yeah, there is no money because the theoretical framework of the inflation targeting does not have money in it. And the reason it doesn't have money is because there is the assumption that economic agents or the representative agent is never ever going to default. Therefore, you don't need financial sector or money. Anyway, more recently, it is clear that this 4.5 hasn't worked, and it looks as if it's been abandoned for good reasons. In terms of Robert, can I finish? In terms of Robert, I think Keynes would have had a few more disagreements with the current macroeconomics. The most important probably is that there is the assumption of the representative agent. And if you have a representative agent, you have no distributional effects. And Keynes was very, very keen in terms of policies to sort out distributional effects. Also, Keynes would have disagreed violently with the assumption of no financial sector in their macroeconomic model. And also, he would have disagreed violently with the vertical Phillips curve. What? Vertical Phillips curve. And, you know, I'm sure there are others. Okay. But I think he would have agreed with Anne's proposition in terms of her proposal. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Philip. Danny Lang?
Yes, Danny Lang, Paris 13. So my question will be shorter. All of you three, in some kind of way, pointed to the necessity to have a more expansionary and counter-cyclical fiscal policy. But the issue that we have is that we don't only have these so-called Maastricht rules and the 3% and 60%. We also have the TSCG that is even more pro-cyclical. Pro-cyclical. And the issue that we have in the current stage of the European Union is that we need unanimity to remove these stupid treaties. So what can we do about this? Should we go for a fiscal currency? How can we get out of this inside of the current framework. I don't see it.
Okay, thank you. So we had 4. So I'll give the chance to the colleagues on this side of the room maybe to have a think now about what they would like to ask, and we'll go back to the panel. Vitor, would you like to pick up the questions that were addressed to you?
Yes. Is it working? There is no button to press. Okay. Very good. So the first question about the short-term asset, because it's short-term. The certificates of deposit that have been indeed approved as secondary legislation by the ECB, so the regulation exists, they were never issued, but they are short-term, as it is the case of similar experiences by central banks in other parts of the world in different situations. So very short-term securities could not fulfill the needs of the safe asset that the euro area requires. We need at least bonds up to 10 years maturity for that purpose. So we need indeed to create an European safe asset, and without mutualization. And as you know, there are 2 proposals around that pretend to achieve that goal. One I don't think can fly, the other one I think can be used. One is just creating a synthetic product whereby some issuer would buy a pool of sovereign bonds of the member countries and then would issue a synthetic security in tranches so that the senior tranche should be safe on the basis of the diversification principles, correlations, and so on. So economists that believe in full rationality of economic agents believe very much in this solution. Markets reject it because no one really believes in practice that having to place this junior tranche at a coupon that would be sufficiently attractive would then allow to place the senior tranche as something cheaper than bonds so that there would be a profit for the synthetic product. It's not profitable, it will never happen, or some degree of mutualization would have to be introduced in the junior tranche. The other solution is to play with seniority of debts instead of diversification principles. And the idea put forward by Zettelmeier and Leandro basically is to have an European institution, the ESM would be the natural institution, would issue a layer of European securities, and with the product of that issuance would then lend to the countries, member countries, for their budget financing requirements, and these loans to the different member countries would have legally, at European level and national level, would have seniority over the remaining national debts. And this subordination would then guarantee that that layer that could go up to 25% of GDP of the euro area, meaning that a market of more than 4 trillion euros of safe assets could be created, and without, indeed, mutualization based on the subordination. Okay, more details would be required, but that's the main idea. So it is a possibility. I don't think that a central bank could really generate what is required for the safe asset. Regarding the M3, the reference value, and all of that. So Andrew mentioned kindly my farewell speech in May of last year. In that same month, I also had a speech in Malta about the past and future of monetary policy of the ECB. And in that, I divide the evolution of monetary policy of the ECB in 4 phases. The first phase was quite almost monetarist. There was a reference value. The monetary pillar was primary and above the so-called economic pillar. It didn't work. At the peak, the M3 was increasing by almost 10%, and there was no inflation whatsoever. So in 2003, a little bit embarrassed, we changed the framework by defining a different way the price stability target, and also by demoting the monetary pillar. And one of the demotions was to say, well, we won't have every year to redefine the reference value for M3, and it was never done before that, and everyone forgot until now the existence of the reference value that still exists in the whole texts. And in that speech, I portray the evolution of the ECB monetary policy and the institution itself from an institution that naturally was at the beginning very much influenced by the views of the Bundesbank to what is now an inflation target institution as other modern central banks in all major countries. So there was an evolution. And by the way, if I may comment on the intervention of Lord Skidelsky, I fully agree that any Keynesian looking to the initial design of monetary union would conclude it's not Keynesian, and it will not work like this. Absolutely. And it was also, you know, the view I had. Initially, I also was a bit skeptical that Portugal should have participated in the beginning of the 90s in the SME and pegging the currency. But okay, that's another story. The problem, and then I became a fan because it was going in a way that it was unavoidable for a country like Portugal in the periphery also to join. But indeed, it was not a Keynesian thing. But it's not the end of the story. The process of integration in Europe and unification is a profound political problem, which the British never understood to this day. They never understood the political motivations of peoples in Europe to have European unification. And accepting that it starts perhaps not so well, but it changes, and it has changed. There have been reforms that at the beginning no one ever dreamed they would be possible. The creation of the ESM with 500 billion capacity of lending to countries and bailing out countries with conditionality. We can discuss with pertinence the conditionality, but the instrument is there. The banking union, the evolution of the ECB, which is totally different from what it was at the beginning. All that is happening and more. And the pressure should continue. And what I said, and many others have said, goes in the direction of saying, well, we need to complete monetary union. It's not complete. And that's the way I see it. I fully respect, of course, the views of people that are more impatient or more idealists and say, well, either it is the full dream or we don't want it. Well, it's not indeed my attitude, but it's totally pertinent that people have the opposite view. They are more demanding, they are more idealist, and they are very useful in humanity to press for things, but it's not what I share. And I don't believe, indeed, that Keynes nowadays would have exactly the same thinking about a movement of integration in Europe. Why? Because in his time, one could still believe in the nation state. And there was, in spite of having trade, there was no globalization. And we should be very, I think, clear about this. We are not going, no one is going to roll back globalization. In the sense that the world is unified with people. The young generations, you know, they look to the world, they know the world, they follow the world. This sort of integration in our mentalities, in our minds, is not going to disappear from future generations. And so the nation state is not the response to the problems that humanity faces now. Starting with the climate change, starting with everything. So we need to go beyond the nation state. And that's, of course, what European integration means. Monetary integration, yes, it has deficiencies, it creates problems, but it's a pressure to go further. I think that looking to the world in this perspective, That's why I am indeed more optimistic about the fight to continue to complete European Monetary Union and European integration.
Yeah, well, that's a very strong statement. It ignores virtually all the political economy literature on the conflicts between economic integration and political legitimacy. I mean, political legitimacy lies with the nation state. If one wants to make progress with the ever closer political union, it's got to be transferred to a European state or a European. People don't even use the right words. A European entity, a political counterpart, a new institution. It shows exactly where the fault line lies in all this, and that transfer has not been made. It's not just the United Kingdom. It's true of other major European countries as well. I mean, so you haven't resolved really that problem. How do you transfer political authority from the nation state where it resides to a supranational entity of some kind? Unsolved problem. Where is the pressure to do that? Of course, the pressure is that you can't go back and therefore you must go forward. Nonsense. We've gone back many times in history. I mean, okay, I'm not advocating we go back. I'm just pointing out that it's wrong to ignore those practical difficulties. Do you really think that there's never going to be a retreat from globalization? The retreat from globalization has already started. It's already started. I mean, what about the tariff war, trade wars that are starting up? What about the long-standing currency war between China and the United States? There has been a retreat from globalization, and I'm not saying it's going to go all the way back to the 30s. Of course it wouldn't. My third point is, how big a crisis do you really need to kick the European horse up its backside? I mean, how big a crisis? These developments in the role of the ECB, in the creation of crisis institutions, were caused by a crisis. They weren't a natural evolution that was taking place slowly in a linear way. You had big disruptions, and I fully praise the way that the institutions responded. How far are these innovations going to be institutionalized? To what extent do treaties need to be amended? And to what extent do you need another big crisis for another big push? I'm not denying that you can muddle through in this way, but this idea of an evolution, irresistible evolution, in the way you've described, I just don't see it. Sorry.
Thank you.
So I think, can I say that I think that, that was a very strong defense, Professor Constancio, of the European Union. And the stronger it is, the more likely it seems to me to not survive. But I have a great deal of sympathy, for the underlying principle of the need for unity across Europe. And I am putting my head on the line, if you like, in the campaign around Brexit right now. I'm doing all that I can possibly do to influence the outcome to defeat Brexit, because Brexit is about Britain aligning itself with the far right of the Republican Party in the United States and with Wall Street, right? And it detaching itself from social Europe, whatever we may think about its inadequacies, right? And so I'm very clear that we need a European entity, whatever we want to call it, that is a counterpart to the United States, to the imperialism of the United States, and indeed the imperialism of China. So I'm sympathetic. But the problem is that longing, that yearning by Europeans for unity, for peace, and for never having a return to the wars of the 20th century has been captured by the financial system and has been captured by, if you like, the 1% who now demand, and this is what I find extraordinary, a safe asset. Now, a safe asset is a public asset. There's a massive shortage of safe assets. Why? Because of monetary radicalism and fiscal consolidation and fiscal conservatism. So, but the free market system, the international free market system, doesn't want to create those assets itself. It wants public backing for assets which will be safe and will represent no risk to them. Because they cannot manage the financial, BlackRock cannot manage the shadow banking system without publicly backed, taxpayer-backed safe assets. And the ECB, as Daniela Gabor explained last night, and the Fed have actively supported the monetary system in its demand for safe assets backed by taxpayers, but without the terms and conditions that should be attached to that gift of a safe asset. And then just on the question of the nation state is dead, right? I want to say just this. Economic policy making is not possible without boundaries. It is not possible for the British people, for the British government, to tax the Brazilians. It's not possible for South Africans to demand British pensions. These are economic policies that require boundaries. And they require boundaries in a democracy for them to have legitimacy, as Robert has explained. You know, for political legitimacy, there needs to be boundaries within which there is a process of accountability. So we're going to have a safe European asset with no accountability about how that asset is used or misused, and with no actually feedback, with still a very imbalanced system of monetary radicalism and fiscal conservatism. And the other reason we need boundaries is that, for example, we know that the climate crisis is a global crisis, right? The climate does not recognize boundaries. But in order to enforce global agreements for the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, we need boundaries. So when we agreed the Montreal Protocol, that was agreed at an international level, but then governments had to go home and enforce the agreement, implement the agreement. And they had to do that with the acquiescence of their people. That is democracy. Of course, we could have, you know, some kind of state socialism or some kind of communism or some kind of fascism where the state and where democracy plays no part. But I don't want to have anything to do with that, right? So I think the threat that is posed to the euro is the fact that it's not democratically accountable to its people and that it actively prevents, as you say, Oliver, the ability of the government to spend, to invest, to generate income and repay debts, but also to borrow to create those assets that the private sector so strongly demands.
Okay. So what I propose, it's a bit like a conflict theory of inflation here. We're sort of conflicting over a limited resource, which is time. What I propose now to do is give Vitor, who is shaking his head quite strongly now, but 1 minute, Vitor, just to take the microphone and...
Yes, as briefly as I can about the safe asset and all the rest of it. If you believe that fiscal policy has to be active, it means issuance of public debt. And that's what we are talking about the safe asset. So it's not any fabrication that would protect, the super capitalists, that's BlackRock and so on, that suddenly have something that they never had before. No, the sovereign bonds have been, well, all over many, many decades, the safe asset of the system. And the problem is that, indeed, there is a scarcity of that, and that's a problem which is bad for the management of the economies. And so, by saying that there should be an increase in public deficits and issuance of public debt, that creates safe assets. And the notion of safe assets that was created, quasi-safe assets, before the crisis is precisely one of the problems. What happened before the crisis? There was not sufficient safe assets, meaning public debt, to use around by the financial system. And the financial system, via repos, securitization, and over-the-counter derivatives, tried to build out of pure private debt what they would consider safer assets, quasi-safe assets. And it failed. And we had the crisis because safe assets cannot be built that way. And that was not the doing of central banks. It was not the central banks that created the repo market and expanded it. It was the change in bankruptcy laws in the US and afterwards in Europe by withdrawing repo contracts from the process of bankruptcy of firms that created the explosion of the repo market. It was not done by the central banks.
But who pushed for that and those amendments to that law?
It was the financial system, but not the official side, not the central banks. And indeed, what is necessary is real safe assets in the system in a bigger way. And when I talked about the need of an European safe asset, is a transformation of the existing already public debt, but making it safer by the device of seniority and subordination of the remaining national debts. So this is a perhaps too technical debate, but it's an important one in the real world where we live.
Okay, thank you. So we're officially now on the time limit. So what I suggest is to give the speakers then each 1 minute maybe to round up, because if we go back in the audience, I'm afraid it's really going to go over the time. So sorry about that. But you had your chance, you guys over here. I have to say you had your chance and you didn't take it. So would you do it like this for one minute?
I just want to say that
not maybe on this now issue of safe assets, but maybe a little bit try the big.
But the cause of the crisis was not technical. The fact of the matter is that the financial system had been demanding for a very long time that as much of the economy should be privatized and controlled by, and the public sector must be shrunk as a share of the total economy. This has been a demand since the 1960s, 70s, certainly since Thatcher and Reagan, right? And so we had this crisis of a shortage of safe assets before the crisis because of the ideology of a system which was to prioritize the interests of the financial sector and to exclude and to diminish as far as possible public spending. So, that for me is not rocket science and it's not technical. We know what they... And when there was amendments to the regulations, including the bankruptcy, that wasn't driven by, the people of the United States. That was driven by Wall Street, naturally. And that precipitated a crisis. So I just think that, this is... To turn this into complicated technical stuff when it isn't, is to actually blind the public to what is really going on here. And in particular, the demand for safe assets by the BlackRocks of this world is to enable them to function in the way that they function because they cannot create their own assets and also that are safe enough for them to gamble. And we need to understand that's how the taxpayer and the public sector is being exploited, and it's not in a position to demand terms and conditions for the use of those assets.
Thanks very much, Anne. Robert.
Yeah, I just want to make an observation about some of the workshops I've been to. I mean, I have an enormous admiration for what I've heard. And also a feeling of sympathy in some way, because I see very bright and imaginative people trying desperately to escape from the traps of the models that they're forced to use, because that's the way economics is, that's the way they need to go. They need to fulfill the requirements of publication in certain kinds of journals in order to get positions. They need to set out their arguments in a particular way. And they want to break out, but it's very hard for them. It's very hard for young economics students at any level, starting from the beginning, but also at the PhD, MSc level. And I wish there was some way that one could break it out, because otherwise, you know, a lot of this this radicalism will dry up. It won't survive, and one will just actually produce stuff that, you know, one doesn't like, but one needs to in order to, you know, get a career. So that, I feel, is the great dilemma of conference like this, and the tragedy and hope of the workshops.
20 seconds still on the former problem. And 20 seconds. You cannot have it both ways. You cannot criticize that before the crisis, ideology constrained the state and so shrink the state and the safe assets, and at the same time criticize now that we should have more safe assets out of a Keynesian fiscal policy. So there is some contradiction there. But it's not the main point, of course, to finish. The main point is that regarding all these problems, there are naturally two camps. There are those who don't believe that the European integration and monetary union can be amended or completed, so they want to go back. I don't think that that would improve the economic and social situation of the European citizens to embark into such a posture and a fight, although pertinent, absolutely respectable, and I fully respect it, or the camp of those that say, well, we started perhaps not in the best place, yes, we have made progress, we have to continue to fight to complete monetary union and go on with the project. And the fact that during these 10 years, there were many, many changes that at the beginning seemed impossible, it should give us some courage. And of course, it's through crisis. You know, one of the founders of the European project, Jean Monnet, you must know also the sentence, the famous sentence he said that European integration goes through crisis because humans do not see normally the risks, the problems, except in a situation of crisis. And yes, it progressed through crisis, through events that created obstacles that had to be surmounted. And that's the way it will continue.
So, thank you very much. Indeed, a round of applause for all the speakers. I would very much like to let this conversation go on. In fact, I would very much like to join in this conversation as well. But I have to bring this plenary to an end because we have some logistical issues, of course, resolving dinner, and I guess you're also getting hungry and thirsty and stuff. So I have a few little sort of housekeeping announcements. If you could just keep seated just for maybe a minute and a half now. So two very quick announcements I have to make. EPOC students in the room, please stay behind when we leave now. Go over to Danny Lang. I don't know exactly what he has planned for you, but you should go to stay with him. There is so the Pluralis students are going to assemble in the lobby at 10:15 this evening after the dinner to go out to the Golden Brown for drinks. If you want to go, if you want to accompany them, they will be leaving here at 10:30. I'm not quite sure where the Golden Brown is, but you can follow the colleagues to that. So they're the two announcements. So I have to, as is usual at the end of conference, express thanks to a few people or a few groups of people. So the first thanks go to the coordination group that did all the planning around this conference. Thank you very much. It's by name Jan Beringer, Sebastian Gecher, Thorsten Nicho, Jan Priever, and myself. Logistic. I don't know. Yeah, that was in alphabetical order of the surnames, by the way. Logistical organization, Sabine Neyman, standing at the front now. And her team, which I've now left, and I won't mention my name. I'd like particularly to thank Dennis Gottschalk. Maybe you could just come up for a second, Dennis. Dennis has been supporting us for 2 years now in the IMK, doing all the planning work, organizational work around the conference, now leaving the IMK to do his doctorate. at the University of Düsseldorf. So we have a small liquid appreciation. Thank you so much to Dennis. Every year I say this when I'm closing. If I'm closing, we have really, we're very well treated here by the hotel staff, I have to say. So even if they don't quite appreciate this, going to them, maybe we can have a round of applause for them. We will be coming back next year, certainly next year, and also the year after. In fact, there are issues about whether we can continue to come, or whether, in fact, this hotel will continue to exist, as it were, in this current form. But certainly next year, I hope to see you all again next year. Before I wish you a safe journey home for tomorrow, remember, or if you didn't know, be aware that the hour changes this evening. So if you have flights and trains tomorrow, the hour goes back though. So your risk is to be 1 hour too early, if you like, or to sleep 1 hour less, not ready to miss your plane or your train, but just be aware of that. You can take the opportunity to maybe discuss a little bit longer, maybe have an additional beer in the hotel bar. So thanks very much for all your efforts, your contributions. See you next year.